She came through the checkpoint at Station Varro on a Tuesday, which was the least interesting day of the week and the least interesting hour of the day, and nobody looked up from what they were doing when the door hissed open and let in the cold. That was the thing about Varro, you stopped looking up after a while. The station sat at the fringe of the consolidated frontier, not quite civilization, not quite wilderness, somewhere in the gray seam between them. 11,000 colonists crammed into 5 ascending tiers of prefab housing and commerce and bureaucracy, all of it bolted to the side of a plateau that the original survey maps had labeled Formation 7, and the settlers had taken to calling the shelf. Below the shelf was 400 meters of sheer rock face, and then the lowland sprawl where the Velgrath roamed. Above was the sky, which out here had a quality to it that newcomers always found unsettling, too vivid, too purple-red at dusk, like a bruise that would not heal. The woman who came through the checkpoint was not a newcomer. You could tell by the way she moved, unhurried, deliberate, each step placed like she was accustomed to surfaces that might not hold. She was tall for a human, lean in the way that came from actual work rather than fitness regimens, and she was wearing what had once been a supply technician's jumpsuit in consolidated gray, but was now 3/4 damage and 1/4 original garment. The left sleeve was gone entirely. The right knee was split open and showed dark dried blood on skin that hadn't seen sunlight in some time. Her face was angular and weathered and still, which was the kind of still that either meant she was very calm or very dangerous, and the two were not mutually exclusive. The checkpoint officer, a kid named Pellerin who was 19 and had been at Varro for 6 months, and had developed the institutional incuriosity of someone 3 times his age, glanced at her transit chip, scanned it without enthusiasm, and waved her through. She walked into Station Varro. Nobody realized who she was. That would change. Her name was Marin Solis, though the name that the Velgrath had given her, the name whispered in their frequency song and spread from warben to warben across the lowlands over the past 7 years, translated to something closer to Bloodfang, or Bloodfang Queen. The translation was imprecise because the Velgrath didn't have a concept that separated those two things. To them, the name was both the wound and the one who delivered it. In their language, a queen was not a title of rank but an acknowledgement of effect, an entity that changed the shape of the world around it without being fully containable. The name didn't mean she had killed anyone, though she had. It meant she had changed things in ways that could not be undone. She didn't look like a queen. She looked like someone who needed a meal and a week of sleep. She got the meal at a counter stall on Tier 2, gray protein paste with reconstituted carbohydrate crackers, the kind of thing that tasted like a meal if you were hungry enough and like punishment if you weren't. She was hungry enough. She ate slowly, not the desperate speed of someone starving, but the methodical pace of someone who had learned a long time ago to take nothing for granted, including the continuation of any particular moment. Around her, the stall was full of workers coming off shift from the processing plants, loud and tired in equal measure, and none of them paid her any attention. She listened to them the way she'd learned to listen to everything in the lowlands, not just for content, but for pattern. The fear underneath the tiredness, the specific topics people avoided, because the avoidance itself was information. She'd been doing this so long it was automatic. Kareth had not taught her this. She developed it on her own in the first months, when the difference between reading a situation correctly and reading it incorrectly was the difference between getting back to camp and not getting back to camp. But Kareth had recognized it in her and had a word for it in frequency song. The word meant, roughly, the alertness of something that has survived. She said to the woman next to her, "The Velgrath hit Outpost 12 again." The woman, whose name tag read Foster and whose expression read profound exhaustion, glanced sideways at her. "3 nights ago. Took 4 people. You just come in from the road." Something like that. "You want news, the board's over there. Foster pointed with her chin toward a public screen mounted above the condiment shelf. "It's not great." The board was cycling through incident reports and station alerts, and the kind of administrative announcements that were designed to communicate information while minimizing alarm, which meant they communicated alarm with the precision of a targeting laser. Velgrath raid on Outpost 12. Settlement 7 requesting emergency resupply. Patrol contact at the lowland margin. Outcome inconclusive. Consolidated command response pending. She read the patrol contact report twice. Outcome inconclusive was doing a lot of work in that phrase. She'd seen 3 different things described that way in consolidated reports. Situations where both sides withdrew voluntarily, situations where humans withdrew and Velgrath did not pursue, and situations where humans died and the people writing the report didn't want to say so directly. The context of the current report, location, time, the fact that it appeared 4 lines below a resupply request from Settlement 7, suggested the third category. She filed it away without expression. Marin read everything. Her face didn't move. She had been gone for 7 years. It had not been 7 good years for the consolidated frontier. The Velgrath had been here before humanity. That was the thing people in the core systems didn't quite grasp. They thought of the frontier as empty space that the Velgrath had wandered into after the colonists arrived, like large territorial animals reacting to intrusion. But the Velgrath had been on this continent for somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years by the best xenobiological estimates, and they had infrastructure, not the kind humans built, not anything that would look like infrastructure to human eyes, but it was there. Frequency song networks that carried information across 300 kilometers. Collective memory encoded in bone patterns that let a Velgrath born in the eastern range know the terrain of the western wetlands as if by instinct. Warband hierarchies that flexed and reformed with a fluidity that made human command structures look brittle. And underneath all of it, something the xenobiology teams had never been able to correctly characterize, because they'd been observing from the outside. A relationship between the Velgrath and the specific land they occupied that was not territorial in any sense humans used the word. They were also 4 meters tall at the shoulder, armored in layered chitin plates that individual small arms fire couldn't reliably penetrate, and they could survive atmospheric temperatures that would kill a human in 40 minutes. Their sensory apparatus included a frequency reception range that made human hearing look vestigial. They communicated in patterns of subvocal sound that could travel kilometers through the geological substrate of the lowlands, effectively making the ground itself a communication medium. They lived, on average, between 90 and 120 years, and their oldest members carried the recorded experience of their warband's history, encoded in their bone structure in calcified frequency patterns that younger Velgrath could read by touch. For the first 12 years of the consolidated frontier, the relationship between the settlers and the Velgrath had been uneasy and violent and cyclical. Humans pushed out, the Velgrath pushed back. Humans built fortifications, the Velgrath found the margins. People died on both sides, more humans than Velgrath, because the math of it was not in humanity's favor. The colonial government kept petitioning Consolidated Command for military support, and Consolidated Command kept explaining that a full deployment would take 18 months and significant political capital, and the frontier wasn't producing enough in the way of rare mineral extraction to justify either. It was, Marin had thought at the time, a very efficient way to ensure that the frontier died slowly instead of all at once. She had been a survey tech when it started. 26 years old, 2 years into her contract, spending her days mapping terrain in the lowlands and her evenings trying to convince herself that the sounds the Velgrath made at night were just territorial and not specifically aimed at the survey team's campsites. She had been good at her job in the way that practical, careful people are good at jobs that require practicality and care. She was not a soldier. She had never wanted to be a soldier. Then Outpost 4 fell. 17 people. She had known most of them by name. Tors, who had the laugh you could hear from 3 tiers up and who saved every credit chip to send home to his sister on Meridian. Quan, who kept a small collection of lowland rock specimens in her locker because she said the geological patterns were beautiful, which everyone agreed was eccentric and nobody argued with because she was right. The whole outpost gone in one night, taken or killed. The patrol team that arrived at dawn finding nothing but structural damage, and the sound the lowlands made, which was the absence of sounds it should have been making. The response from Consolidated Command had taken 6 weeks to arrive in physical form, a memo recommending caution, and a promise of increased patrol frequencies. The patrol frequencies had not materially increased. A second memo arrived 3 weeks after that, inquiring into the mineral survey status of the region around Outpost 4 and recommending continuation of survey operations to support extraction viability assessments. Marin had made a different decision. She had gone into the lowlands alone. It hadn't been a suicide mission, though several people at the time had told her it was. It had been a research mission, in the same way that she was a researcher, systematic, methodical, driven by the conviction that if you didn't understand something you couldn't survive it, and if you couldn't survive it you were going to die anyway, so you might as well go find out. She had taken 3 weeks of rations, her survey equipment, and the frequency recorder she'd been using to catalog atmospheric data, and she had walked off the shelf and into Velgrath territory. She had told one person she was going, Erickson, who had been a junior administrator at the time and had not yet developed the careful blankness that 4 years of managing a frightened population would carve into him. He had looked at her with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: genuine fear for her, the administrative awareness that he should stop her, and something under both of those that she'd only recognized years later as the beginning of hope. He said, "You understand I can't officially authorize this," she said. "I'm not asking for authorization." And she went. What happened over the next 7 years was complicated. The first 6 months were the part she'd expected to be the hardest. They were instead merely hard in the ordinary ways: finding water, finding shelter, learning to navigate without satellite assistance, learning to read Velgrath frequency song as threat or neutral or curious. She made mistakes in those months that should have been fatal and weren't, which she credited partly to luck and partly to the fact that the Velgrath, whatever else they were not in the habit of killing things that weren't threatening them. She had been small and clearly confused and non-threatening in those first weeks, and the Velgrath had watched her the way you watch something that might become a problem but hasn't yet. They had known she was there from the second week. She understood this around month 3, when she'd started to be able to read the difference between frequency songs that included a reference pattern she'd come to identify as herself. The way the Velgrath encoded the presence of a specific entity into their ongoing communication. They had been talking about her. She could tell they were talking about her before she understood anything else about the content of those conversations. Contact came at month 2. She hadn't initiated it. The Velgrath she came to know as Kareth had simply appeared at a distance of 12 meters from her camp one morning, sat down with the deliberate, unhurried motion that she'd eventually understand, was a specific postural vocabulary meaning non-aggression, and produced a low, sustained pattern of subvocal frequencies. She had sat very still for a long time. Then she had taken out her frequency recorder and begun documenting. It took 6 months to develop the rudiments of two-way communication, 2 years to develop anything approaching fluency. She had no idea in those 2 years whether the fluency was real or whether she was projecting coherence onto patterns that might be more random than she wanted them to be. The test was whether predictions held, whether her interpretation of a pattern allowed her to anticipate what came next, and whether the patterns she produced got responses that matched her intent. Slowly, with frustrating inconsistency, and then with gradually improving consistency, they did. What she learned in those 2 years changed everything. She thought she knew about what was happening on the consolidated frontier. She left a credit chip on the counter and walked toward the administrative district. The commander of Station Varro was a man named Erickson who had been in the position for 4 years, and who managed the very difficult job of administering a population under chronic existential stress, with something approaching competence. He was in his 50s, solid without being heavy, with the kind of face that had learned to project calm as a professional skill. He had, she noticed when she was shown into his office, a small lowland rock specimen on his desk. She didn't ask about it. She filed it. His office was on Tier 4, which meant it had a window, and through the window on a clear day you could see all the way to the lowland margin. He was looking at that margin when his assistant buzzed and told him there was a woman in reception who didn't have an appointment but had the specific transit designation that indicated she'd come in from beyond the frontier perimeter. He told his assistant to send her in. She came through the door and he looked at her and something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not recognition, but the anticipation of both. "You came in from the lowlands," he said. "Yes." "How long were you out there?" 7 years, 2 months, and some days. I stopped counting the days after the first 18 months. Erickson was quiet for a moment. "We listed you as deceased 2 years after you went in." "I know." She sat down without being invited. "I need to talk to you about the Velgrath." "Everyone who comes through my door needs to talk about the Velgrath." "Not like this." He studied her, the torn jumpsuit, the absence of the left sleeve, the scar that ran from her right jaw to somewhere below her collar. The absolute stillness of someone who had been, for a very long time, in situations where stillness was survival. "All right," he said. "Talk." She talked for 4 hours. She told him about Karath, not his actual name, which was a pattern of subvocal frequencies she could produce, but had never been able to transcribe into anything a human phonetic system could represent. Who was the equivalent of a scout elder in the warband whose territory encompassed the area she'd originally been surveying. Karath was old by Velgrath reckoning, somewhere north of 100 years, and he was carrying in his bone structure the recorded experience of 6 generations of his warband's history. He had seen this continent before the colony ships arrived. He had watched the first human structures go up from the high ground of the ridge lines. He had been alive when the relationship was still at the stage of mutual incomprehension, before it became violent. He had sat down 12 meters from her camp and made a peace sound. She told him about the Velgrath territorial memory, the concept she'd spent 2 years trying to understand correctly before she was confident she had it. The lowlands weren't, to the Velgrath, a resource or a territory in the human geopolitical sense. They were constitutive. The Velgrath who lived here were part of the lowlands in the same way the rock formations were, and the intrusion of the colonists registered not as invasion, which implied an external threat, but as something closer to disease. Something happening from inside. The raids weren't military strategy, they were immune response. And she told him about Outpost 4. The survey teams, her own survey teams, running routes she'd helped design, had been mapping a formation in the lowlands that preliminary mineral scans flagged as potentially rich in trilite ore. The formation was about 40 kilometers from Outpost 4. It was also, in Velgrath territorial memory, what she'd come to call an origin ground, the place where a warband's collective memory said they had first become themselves. The closest human equivalent she could find was a combination of founding document, cemetery, and living sanctuary, none of which individually or together quite captured it. The origin ground was where the warband's oldest Velgrath would go to add their bone-carried memory to the geological substrate when they died. It was the physical record of the warband's existence. It was not separable from their continued being. The survey teams had been mapping it for extraction assessment for 2 months before Outpost 4 fell. Erickson sat back in his chair, We didn't know. No, you didn't. I didn't either at the time. I designed those survey routes. I sent those teams out. She said it without flinching because she'd had 7 years to look at it without flinching. I'm not telling you this to assign blame. I'm telling you because understanding the mechanism is the only way to change the outcome. You're saying if we'd known. I'm saying we need to have a different conversation than the one we've been having for 12 years. She leaned forward. The stillness in her had shifted into something more focused, more active. He had the first clear impression that he was not talking to a survey tech who'd gone feral in the lowlands. He was talking to someone who had crossed a divide that most humans would consider uncrossable and come back carrying something on the other side, hard one, carefully held, not negotiable. I've been talking to the Velgrath for 7 years. I know their warband structure and their territorial boundaries, and which warbands are in active conflict with each other, and which ones have maintained cautious peace for 3 generations. I know what they want, which is not for us to leave. They understand we're not leaving, but for us to stop doing specific things that are, from their perspective, existential. And if Consolidated Command sends the military deployment they've been promising, this goes from a chronic problem to a war that we will not win. The silence in the office was the kind that happens when someone says a true thing that the listener has been carefully not thinking. You're saying we can negotiate, Erickson said. I'm saying negotiation already happened. I've been doing it for 7 years. I'm saying I need your authorization to formalize it. He asked what she needed. She told him. It was a short list: diplomatic credentials, a communication team, a 90-day delay on the military deployment, suspension of the mineral survey of the origin ground formation, communicated to the Velgrath via frequency song at the lowland margin. She needed nobody to shoot anything for 90 days. Erickson looked at her for a long time. The military deployment is already in motion, authorized 3 months ago. It arrives in 62 days. Can it be halted? Not by me, by the regional director, and above her Consolidated Command. Then I need to talk to the regional director. She's at Garrison Station, 8 days by transport. Marin stood up. I'd better go then. I'll arrange transport. He paused. There are people who are going to say you've been out there too long, that you've been compromised. Stockholm Syndrome, alien sympathy, whatever framework they decide on. You should be prepared for that. I've been preparing for that for 7 years. She moved toward the door, then stopped. She didn't turn around. There's something else. Something I didn't include in the briefing because I'm still working out how to present it. Tell me. Kareth is dying, she said it quietly. He's been failing for 18 months. He's the reason I'm back. He sent me back. He said the equivalent of, go finish what we started because I won't be there to keep the warbands aligned much longer, and if you don't finish it before I'm gone, the younger commanders won't hold. A pause. He is the reason any of this is possible. He decided 7 years ago to sit down 12 meters from a human camp and make a peace sound instead of a threat sound. I don't know exactly what that cost him within his own warband, but it was significant. He took a chance on me when nothing in his experience or his warband's 1,000-year history gave him any reason to think it would work. He is the reason I know what I know. He is the reason I'm standing here. She was very still. I owe him the finish of this. I don't intend to fail. She went through the door. The 8-day transport to Garrison Station was the longest 8 days of her life since the first 6 months in the lowlands. She reviewed her notes. She ran vocabulary and grammar in frequency song, not because she needed to, but because the repetition was steadying. She allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to think about what she had lost. Not the abstract losses. What she had lost was continuity, the ordinary texture of a life lived in connection with other people. Friends who had, reasonably, concluded she was dead and organized themselves accordingly. The small accumulated knowledge of how human social spaces worked, how to pace a conversation, where to stand so you didn't mark yourself as someone who'd forgotten the geometry of human gathering. She'd come back to a world that had moved on without her, which was how the world was supposed to work, and she found the gap more disorienting than she'd expected. More disorienting than the lowlands had ever been, because at least in the lowlands the strangeness was honest. She thought about Kareth. The first time he'd attempted to explain territorial memory, she'd understood it intellectually and felt nothing. She'd mapped it to human equivalents, ancestral land, sacred sites, the places humans return to because their meaning exceeds their physical reality. She'd thought she had it. She hadn't had it until the third year, when she'd been sick. Something in the lowland water table. A biological incompatibility she hadn't accounted for, and she'd been down for 11 days with a fever that peaked high enough that she'd stopped being confident she was going to make it. She'd been aware of Kareth at the margins of her shelter for most of that time. Not touching, the Velgrath had a complex relationship with contagion that made physical contact with sick things an extreme exception. But present, a shadow at the membrane. A low sustained subharmonic that wasn't quite frequency song, more like the overflow of thinking, the sound that happened when a thought was too large to hold in silence. He'd been there when she went to sleep and there when she woke up, and she'd once, in the 7th or 8th day, asked him why he didn't just go. He'd produced a pattern that took her 3 more years to fully parse. The approximate meaning was, this place is part of what I am and you are in this place, and so I am here. That was when she'd understood, not as a concept, as a fact, not as information about the Velgrath but as information about what she was too, and had been all along, a creature whose identity was continuous with the places and beings she was continuous with. She'd been trying to understand the Velgrath as something alien to herself. The understanding she'd gotten sick enough to have was that the continuity was the point. That was what she and Kareth shared, underneath everything else. They were both beings for whom presence was an act of meaning. Garrison Station was 3 times the size of Varro, and had the energy of an institution that understood itself to be important. Regional Director Cheung was in her 60s, with a politician's quality of attention, genuine when she deployed it, which meant you understood the compliment when she turned it on you fully. She turned it on Marin in the 2nd hour of their meeting, when Marin had finished explaining the Velgrath territorial memory framework, and Cheung had stopped calculating political angles and started actually listening. You're asking me to halt a military deployment that's been 2 years in the authorization process, Cheung said. I'm asking you to delay it 90 days. The distinction matters to you. The distinction is the difference between a pause and a cancellation. I'm not asking you to surrender the deployment. I'm asking you to give me 90 days to demonstrate that what I've built with the Velgrath can hold. And if it doesn't hold, then you deploy the military with better intelligence about Velgrath warband structure and territorial priorities than Consolidated Command has ever had, and the operation is more effective than it would have been. Either way, you're better off for the delay. Cheung stood and walked to her window. Garrison Station's windows were bigger than Varro's and faced south, toward the lowland sprawl. At this distance you couldn't see anything moving. You could almost believe it was just terrain. 50 days, she said. I need 60. 50, and you report to me every 10 days. Agreed. She went back to Varro. She assembled the communication team, 2 linguists and a xenobiologist, young and sharp and appropriately terrified. She trained them for 11 days. Frequency song interpretation, threat song, warning song, greeting song. The subharmonic patterns that distinguished a senior Velgrath from a scout. The single most important practical skill, how to not respond to a frequency pattern when you were uncertain of its meaning, because a wrong response was more dangerous than silence. She was harder on them than she intended to be. She thought about Outpost 4 and didn't soften it. The linguist named Tasha was going to be very good at this eventually. She had the thing that couldn't be taught, the capacity to hold uncertainty without resolving it prematurely. She heard a pattern she didn't understand and sat with not understanding until understanding arrived or didn't, and she reported accurately in both cases. Marin told her this privately on the last evening of training, because she'd been hard on her in front of the others, and she didn't want that to be the last thing. Tasha looked at her with an expression that was trying to decide how to receive a compliment from someone who scared her. Marin understood the expression because she'd worn it herself, a long time ago. On the third day of training, she got a message that Karath's condition had deteriorated. It came through the frequency song monitor at the lowland margin, a scout pattern from a specific location she recognized. She'd given that scout band the frequency to send if this happened in the last weeks before she'd left the lowlands. She hadn't been certain they'd hold it for this long. They had. Tasha found her in the corridor between shifts and handed her the transcript. Her expression said she understood more than she'd been told. Marin thanked her, went to her room and sat with the message. She had a list of things she needed to finish, and she was going to finish all of them, and that was what she had instead of grief right now, and she was going to use it. She went into the lowlands on day 12. The communication team held the margin. She walked forward alone, with a frequency monitor clipped to her belt and nothing else she hadn't carried for 7 years. It felt strange to have backup at all. She'd spent so long doing this alone that the presence of people behind her registered as a variable she had to account for, which was the opposite of how backup was supposed to feel. She produced the arrival frequency. Low, patterned, the Velgrath equivalent of announcing peaceful intent. The answer came from the ridge line to her east, not Karath. The pattern was too quick, too clipped a younger signature, but it was response, not threat, and she walked toward it. The negotiations took 37 days. 5 warband representatives. She had known one of them, a mid-ranking commander she called Sethais, from the 3rd year, when he'd been a junior scout assigned by Karath to guide her through the lowland terrain. He was cautious with her in a way that would have seemed cold to a human observer, but was, in Velgrath terms, precise acknowledgement of status. He was treating her like a claim that had been verified. Carefully, because the verification mattered. Each representative came carrying Karath's frequency signature as credential, the Velgrath equivalent of a letter of introduction, except that the signature was also a piece of Karath's identity, literally, a bone-carried pattern his representatives could produce and other warbands could verify. He was authorizing these talks with something more than his name. He was authorizing them with himself. What she was asking for was a disclosure agreement. Not full, not all at once. A beginning. A list of sites to be designated non-extraction zones as a precondition for anything else. Territorial memory sites, origin grounds, the places where warbands dead had added themselves to the land. She was asking them to trust that this information would be honored rather than used as a survey map for targeted resource extraction. She was asking them to believe that humans could commit to something and keep it. She understood, going in, why that was the hardest possible thing to ask. She'd spent 7 years understanding how thoroughly the early years of the frontier had damaged whatever trust was possible, not through malice, but through the particular human combination of urgency, ignorance, and good intentions that produced damage so efficiently that malice could rarely match it. The Velgrath didn't have a word for forgiveness. They had a word for the acknowledgement that a situation had changed. The closest thing they had to a mechanism for moving past harm was a set of demonstrated actions over time that produced a different pattern. Not apology, evidence. She was offering evidence. 7 years of her own demonstrated presence, and an agreement that would begin to produce the rest. On day 34, Sethais produced a frequency pattern she had to ask him to repeat 3 times. Karath had sent a message. She held very still while the pattern registered fully. She ran the vocabulary in her head, not because she needed to. She'd known this phrase for 3 years, but because holding still while she processed it gave her something to do with the feeling. The message was, honor the path we made. An old-form word, the kind that carried the weight of the bone-carried histories. The kind the oldest Velgrath used for things they considered permanent. She finished the negotiations on day 37. The agreement she brought back was imperfect and partial, and contained 17 carve-outs and 4 appendices, and would require ongoing work to maintain, and could collapse at any time if the wrong person on either side did the wrong thing. It was also the first formal agreement that had ever been reached between any human governmental body and any Velgrath warband anywhere on the continent. 11 sites designated as non-extraction zones with joint monitoring protocols. A frequency song communication channel with regular scheduled contact. A conflict notification mechanism that gave both sides a way to indicate that a threshold was being approached before it was crossed. Consolidated Command sat on it for 3 weeks, and then replied with 9 pages of concerns and 1 paragraph of provisional authorization to continue. The military deployment was postponed indefinitely. She was on Tier 2 at the counter stall, same stall, different protein paste, the same loud, tired, end-of-shift crowd, when she got the message about Kareth. Tasha handed her the transcript with the same expression she'd had the first time she'd given Marin something difficult to hold. Marin thanked her, sat with the message. Around her, the stall was full of people who had worked hard and needed to stop working, and none of them knew what she was holding. She thought about the first time she'd understood what Kareth was doing when he produced that low subharmonic between frequency songs. The sound that wasn't quite communication, the overflow of thinking, the sound that happened when a thought was too large to hold in silence. She'd recognized it eventually as the Velgrath equivalent of the way some people hum when they're working through something difficult. A sound that meant, I am still here, I am still in the process of being, don't be alarmed. She had found it once she understood it, deeply familiar. She put down her credit chip and walked toward the lowland margin. She went alone. She left the comms unit at the edge of the human zone, not to prevent anyone from following, but because this was not something she wanted translated. She walked into the lowlands in the late afternoon when the sky was going through its bruised progression, blue-white to violet to the deep red of dusk, and she found the flat place near the formation that Kareth had named for her in the 4th year. The name included a subharmonic she couldn't produce, so she'd given it a name of her own, privately, which she'd never told anyone, Corner of the Sky. She sat down on the rock. She produced the Velgrath morning frequency. She had learned it from Kareth in the 4th year and had never used it before now. It was low and complex, and when she produced it, it occupied space in a way that surprised her, larger than her body should be able to generate, reaching into frequencies she could feel in her sternum and in the bones of her wrists. She held it for a long time, past the point where it was comfortable. That was how it was supposed to work. The morning frequency was not something you completed quickly. You held it until it was finished with you. The lowland went quiet around it. Not silent, the lowlands were never silent, but the specific quality of attention the Velgrath made when they were receiving something important had a sound distinct from silence. A collective focusing, a withdrawal of the small ambient frequency songs that served as ongoing territorial declaration. An audience. She finished. The sky had gone fully to red. From the ridge to the east a response came, then another from the north, farther away. Then a third, directionally uncertain, which meant it was being carried by the geological substrate rather than through air, a deep-channel transmission, the kind used for long distances, multiple warbands. She hadn't known if the morning frequency she produced would propagate through the network. She'd never sent it before, and the network carried patterns differently depending on the identity of the sender and the intended audience. She hadn't intended any particular audience. She'd intended Kareth, and Kareth was no longer receiving. But the network carried it anyway, and the answers came back. She sat at the corner of the sky until the red went to dark and the night sounds of the lowlands resumed around her. The frequency songs of the evening restaking territorial boundaries, the deeper subharmonics of the older Velgrath running through the substrate, the ordinary continuation of things. She listened to it for a while. It was good sound. She'd missed it, in the 37 days of formal negotiations, more than she'd expected to. She stood up and walked back toward the human zone. The lights of Station Varro were bright against the plateau above her, a whole vertical city of light and life and fear and effort, and she climbed toward it. Tasha was waiting at the margin, with a jacket she hadn't asked for and didn't refuse. The director sent a message, Tasha said. Consolidated Command wants to send a full diplomatic team, official delegation. They want to know if you'll lead the contact protocols. Tell them yes. She also said, direct quote, that there are going to be people who don't like this, people who wanted the military option, people who are going to say you crossed some line that shouldn't be crossed. Marin held the jacket and looked up at the lights of the station. 11,000 people on a shelf of rock above a continent that had been occupied for 10,000 years before they arrived. Most of them scared. Most of them trying to hold on to the lives they'd built here. Most of them with no framework for understanding what she'd spent 7 years learning. They would have to learn parts of it. That was the next 7 years of work. Maybe the next 20. She was 33 years old and she was going to be doing this until she couldn't anymore. She thought about Kareth sitting down 12 meters from her camp in the second month. She thought about what that had cost him and what it had started. She thought about honor the path we made. Tell her, Marin said, that I've been crossing lines for 7 years. Tell her I'm not done. She walked into the station. The checkpoint officer, Pellerin, still 19, still in the process of learning to see less, glanced up as she came through the door. She was wearing the same torn jumpsuit she'd arrived in. Left sleeve gone, dried blood on the right knee. Nothing about her was different from the woman who had walked in 3 months ago and been waved through, because Tuesday was the least interesting day and nobody was looking. He looked at her for a moment. He looked away. She walked past him into the tier and the stairwell and the ascending levels of the station. She did not look back. Somewhere in the lowlands below the shelf, the morning frequency was still moving through the geological substrate, carrying from Warben to Warben across distances she couldn't see, being received and answered and sent on. Kareth's name, his real name, the one she'd never been able to write down, was being spoken in it, encoded in the way the Velgrath encoded the dead, as a bone pattern in the stone, permanent part of the ground. Part of what the place was, part of what all the beings connected to that place were. She had never had a name for what she owed him. She didn't have one now. She had the work. She had the 50 days becoming the rest of her life. She had an agreement that could still fall apart, and a communication channel that required constant attention, and a full diplomatic team arriving in 41 days that she would have to train from scratch, and a geological survey suspension that she would have to argue into something permanent. She had what he had given her, the path and the obligation to honor it. She took the stairs 2 at a time. There was a lot left to do. The first diplomatic team arrived 41 days later and consisted of 6 people, none of whom had ever been to the consolidated frontier before. 4 of them had never been off a core world. Marin could tell which 4 within the first 20 minutes of the orientation session she ran in the Tier 4 briefing room, because they were the ones whose faces did the thing faces do when the conceptual reality of a situation is replaced by the actual reality. A kind of recalibration, sometimes quick and sometimes slow, that was always visible if you were watching. She'd watched it happen in herself once, 3 months into the lowlands, when the survey data she'd been treating as the actual character of the territory had been replaced by the territory itself. She'd stopped in the middle of a mapping route and looked up and understood, with a physical completeness that data couldn't provide, that she was standing in something that was not indifferent to her presence, not hostile, not welcoming, just aware, in ways that the survey instruments had never been designed to detect because the designers hadn't known there was anything to detect. She had stood there for a long time. She gave the diplomatic team 4 days of briefing before she told them about Karath. She did it in the sequence she'd told everything: context first, then mechanism, then implication, because the sequence mattered. If you told people about Karath first, they heard him as an exception. If you told them what he'd known and decided and done inside the full context of what the Velgrath were and what the frontier had been, they heard him correctly, as the most consequential single action taken by any being on this planet since the colony ships landed. A being who had looked at the long record of mutual harm and decided, without any structural incentive to do so, to try something different. The youngest member of the diplomatic team, a policy analyst from the core worlds named Radhika, who had the specific competence of someone who had never been told she wasn't capable of learning anything, sat with that for a long time after the briefing. He didn't have any reason to believe it would work, she said finally. No. He just did it anyway. He had a reason, Marin said. It just wasn't a strategic reason. It was something closer to an assessment about what was possible. He looked at the situation and he concluded that the situation could be other than it was. That's a different thing from believing it would work. Radhika looked at her. What's the difference? Believing it will work is about probability. Believing something is possible is about category. She'd been trying to put this into words for a long time. He wasn't calculating odds. He was making a claim about what kind of thing the situation was, whether it was the kind that could only go one direction or the kind that could go more than one. He decided it was the second kind. And then he acted from that. Radhika was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's what you did too, when you went in." Marin hadn't thought about it that way before. She sat with it. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." She had gone into the lowlands believing it was possible to understand the Velgrath. Not that she would, not that the attempt would succeed, not that she'd live through the attempt. Just that the category of possible was open. That was all she'd needed to move. The diplomatic sessions that followed over the next weeks were complex and slow, in the way of things that are being built to last. Tasha had gotten good enough in frequency song interpretation that she could monitor the Velgrath communication channel independently, catching patterns that Marin then verified, which meant that, for the first time in the history of the consolidated frontier, there was redundant human capacity for this communication. Not just one person, one exhausted woman who could be injured or sick or unavailable. A team. A beginning of something institutional. The Velgrath sent Sethais to the early diplomatic meetings. He came alone, which was a specific diplomatic statement. A single Velgrath at the margin, not a warband presence, which in their protocol meant something like, "We are meeting person to person before we meet people to people." Marin had explained this to the team beforehand and watched them absorb it. Radhika had taken notes. The policy analyst in her was already thinking about formalization, about documentation, about how to turn the understanding of these protocols into something transferable. Good, that was exactly right. The extraction survey suspension held. Consolidated Command had included enough hedging language in the provisional authorization to make it technically still reversible, which Marin was going to spend the next 6 months converting into something harder. She had already written the first 3 memos and was working on the 4th. The process was frustrating in the specific way that bureaucratic processes are frustrating when you know what the answer needs to be and the path to getting there is long and made of small steps, and the people you're arguing with aren't malicious, just slow. She could work with slow. She'd worked with slow for 7 years. She had patience that had been built by the lowlands, which were not in a hurry. There were, as Erickson and Chung had both predicted, people who were not happy. two members of the original colonial council, had sent public statements questioning the wisdom of any agreement that formally acknowledged Velgrath territorial claims, on the grounds that this created legal precedent that could be used to restrict human settlement. A retired consolidated military officer with 3 campaigns on the frontier had gone on the public comm network to say that 7 years of what he called cultural submersion had compromised Marin's capacity for objective assessment. A resource extraction consortium had filed a formal complaint with Consolidated Command about the survey suspension, citing potential losses of projected trilite revenue. She read all of it. She answered none of it directly. She submitted a formal response to Consolidated Command addressing the legal questions about territorial acknowledgement, with 70 pages of precedent from interstellar settlement law, drafted with Radhika's help, that took the extraction consortium's argument apart so thoroughly that the consortium's own legal team filed an internal memo recommending they withdraw the complaint. She gave one interview to a frontier news service and said, precisely and without emotion, that the question of whether she had been compromised by 7 years of direct contact with the Velgrath was a question that could be answered by looking at the outcomes and asking whether they served the consolidated frontier's actual interests. She said the outcomes included no military deployment, no war, a functional communication channel, and an agreement that for the first time gave the colonial administration advanced notice of Velgrath thresholds before they were crossed. She said if that was what compromise looked like, she'd take it. The interview ran without response from the military officer. She took that as its own kind of outcome. On the 43rd day after she'd come back to Varro, she went back to the corner of the sky. Not for any specific reason. The diplomatic work was ongoing. The team was functioning. There was nothing she urgently needed to do at the lowland margin on that particular day. She went because she wanted to, which was a kind of decision she'd been making less of lately, and she'd noticed the reduction and decided to correct it. She sat on the rock and looked at the lowland terrain in the afternoon light, the rock formations that she'd spent 2 years learning to navigate with landmark precision, the ridge lines where Velgrath scouts moved at intervals she'd memorized, the specific color the sky made here at this hour, that purple-red quality that newcomers found unsettling and that she had found, after long enough, simply accurate. The sky was what it was, and what it was this color, and the color was fine. She was aware as she sat of a frequency at the edge of her perception, not a message, not directed. Just the ambient subharmonic of the geological substrate carrying the ordinary daily communication of the warband whose territory this was. She'd been sitting in it for years without thinking of it as presence. It had just been the sound the ground made. She thought about it now, deliberately, and it was presence. It was the warband, specifically, its ongoing aliveness expressed in pattern, the way a forest has a sound that is the forest and not just the individual trees. The warband was here, and had been here for 1,000 years, and the sound of that was in the ground under her, and she was sitting in it. She thought about Tors and his laugh, and his sister on Meridian. She thought about Quan and the rock specimens she'd collected, because the geological patterns were beautiful, which they were. She thought about the 17 people at Outpost 4, and she thought about the Velgrath who had died in the years of raiding and counter-raiding before she'd gone into the lowlands, whose names she didn't have but who had died for exactly the same reason Tors and Quan had died, because neither side knew what the other side was, and the not knowing had been fatal. She sat with that for a while. She didn't do anything with it. She'd learned over 7 years to sit with things that couldn't be undone and not demand that the sitting accomplish something. Things that were true stayed true whether you looked at them or not. Looking at them directly was just the choice to carry them honestly instead of sideways. The afternoon light moved. The sky went through its colors. The subharmonic in the ground continued. She stayed until the light changed, and then she stood up and walked back to the human zone. Tasha was not at the margin this time. Nobody was waiting. She walked back through the checkpoint. Pellerin had learned in the past weeks to nod at her rather than just scan and wave, which was a small thing and not a small thing, and up through the tiers to the administrative level where the diplomatic team had set up working space in what had been a conference room and was now something in between a command center and a classroom. Radhika was working. She looked up when Marin came in, clocked her expression, and made an assessor's judgment about what kind of check-in the moment needed. "We got a preliminary response from 2 of the Eastern Warbands," she said. "Seth Eyes forwarded it through the channel this afternoon. They're not rejecting the framework. They want clarification on 3 of the monitoring protocols." "Which 3? Radhika handed her the transcript. Marin read it. The questions were, she thought, good questions, pointed, specific, the kind that came from someone who had looked at the language of the agreement carefully and found the places where the meaning could be read multiple ways. She'd expected this. The Velgrath were careful with language in ways that humans often weren't, because for them the language of an agreement was encoded into the territorial memory and retrieved with the same precision as bone-carried history. What the agreement said was what it said. They wanted to be sure it said what they thought it said. "I can draft responses to these," Radhika said. "You want to check them before they go out?" "Yes, and run them by Tasha first for the frequency song equivalents. I want to make sure the concepts translate before we send the language." "On it." Marin sat down at the far end of the table and opened her own work queue. The 6 memos she was working on, the appendix revisions for the agreement, the training curriculum she was building for the 2nd communication cohort that Consolidated Command had tentatively authorized. The list was long and would stay long, and that was how it was supposed to be. This was not the kind of work that finished. It was the kind that continued. She worked until late. The rest of the team filed out in 1s and 2s. At some point someone left a cup of something warm near her elbow, which she drank without looking up. The station settled into its night sounds, the reduced hum of systems running at lower load, the different quality of quiet that happened when 11,000 people were mostly sleeping. She finished the 4th memo. She started the 5th. Outside the window, the sky had gone to dark, and below the shelf the lowlands were invisible in the night. But she knew they were there in the way she always knew, not as absence but as presence, as the ongoing fact of a world that had been here long before her and would be here long after, that had been changed by her presence and had changed her, that she was continuous within ways she couldn't fully account for and didn't need to. She thought very briefly about Kareth. Then she went back to the 5th memo. There was a lot left to do. The formal recognition came 11 months later, which was faster than anyone had projected and slower than Marin had needed it to be. And it came in the form of a single paragraph buried in a Consolidated Command administrative order authorizing the establishment of a permanent frontier diplomatic office with a budget and a staff complement, and a mandate to continue the work she had started. She read the paragraph 3 times, then she filed it. She was in the middle of training the 3rd communication cohort when the order came through. 12 people this time, because the 2nd cohort had demonstrated that 12 was a viable number, that the comprehension capacity for frequency song interpretation was distributed across the population in the same distribution as any other aptitude, and that with proper training and enough time, a significant percentage of motivated individuals could achieve functional competence. Not her fluency. Not 7 years of daily immersion, but enough to staff a shift rotation. Enough that the communication channel no longer depended on a single human being present and alive. That was the thing she had been working toward without quite naming it, the elimination of herself as a single point of failure. She had gone into the lowlands alone because there was no other way to start. She had come back alone because the understanding she'd built was not transferable in the abstract. It required her specific presence to translate. But everything she had built since coming back was aimed at making the thing survivable without her, which was how anything worth building had to be designed. It had to outlast its builder. That was the test. The Eastern Warband sent a formal acknowledgement of the diplomatic order through the Frequency Song channel on the same day it was published. The acknowledgement was a pattern Marin had never received before, which meant she had to work it out from component elements and verify the interpretation with Tasha and with the two most senior members of the second cohort before she was confident she had it right. The pattern meant, approximately, that they had received the signal of the change and were noting it in their territorial memory. That was all. They were not celebrating. They were not expressing approval. They were noting, with the precision they brought to all things permanent, that this had happened, and that it was now part of the record of what had happened in this place. She had Radhika prepare a formal acknowledgement in return. They sent it through the channel. The pattern that came back was brief. A single signature, the frequency of the senior warband elder who had taken over coordination of the communication channel after Karath, a being she'd been slowly getting to know over the past year through the careful translation of everything Karath had built. The signature meant received. She sat with that for a moment in the communication room, while the cohort trainees worked on their frequency exercises around her, and Tasha monitored the ambient channel, and the afternoon light came through the window at the angle it came through at this hour. Then she nodded once, to herself, and went back to the curriculum she'd been writing. There was still a lot left to do. But the path was made, and it was holding, and the morning frequency she had sent into the lowlands 11 months ago was still moving through the geological substrate of a continent that had been here for 10,000 years before she arrived, and would be here for 10,000 more, carrying Karath's name in the stone, permanent, the way things were permanent when they had been honestly made and honestly kept. She worked. Outside the window, the sky was going red.